This little piece of clay from the library's collections is packed full of information from 4,200 years ago. The language of the inscription is Sumerian.
Sumerian literature.
The man who taught the world everything it knows about the first human civilization spent the final years of his life trying to warn us that almost all of it was wrong, not a mistranslation, not a minor historical error. The entire framework. According to people who worked beside him, his final discovery terrified him so deeply that he began revisiting translations he had defended for more than 40 years. Then, inside a quiet basement archive filled with ancient Sumerian tablets, Samuel Noah Kramer found something he never expected to see. A mistake hidden in plain sight for thousands of years. And if Kramer was right, then the story we have been taught about the origins of civilization may have been built on a misunderstanding from the very beginning. Before we uncover what he found, take a second to subscribe, because the deeper this investigation goes, the more disturbing the evidence becomes. By 1988, Kramer had spent nearly 6 decades translating some of the oldest written records on Earth. The University of Pennsylvania Museum held tens of thousands of clay tablets recovered from the ancient city of Nippur, and Kramer knew many of them by sight alone. But one tablet kept pulling him back, a text he had already translated in 1949, a translation accepted by scholars around the world. For 40 years, something about it had felt wrong. Then one afternoon, at 91 years old, he picked it up again, and everything changed. To understand why Samuel Noah Kramer's final discovery shook the foundations of ancient history, you first have to understand who he was and the influence he carried in the academic world. Kramer was born as Simcha Kramer in 1897 in Zhashkiv, Ukraine, into the family of a Hebrew teacher. During the violent pogroms under Tsar Nicholas II, his family escaped Eastern Europe and eventually settled in Philadelphia when he was still a child. His early adult life was uncertain and directionless. He taught at his father's school, experimented with business, and even tried pursuing writing before stumbling into a Sumerian studies course at Dropsy College near the age of 30. That moment changed everything. What Kramer encountered was unlike any language challenge scholars had faced before. Sumerian had been extinct for nearly 2,000 years. There were no native speakers, no proper dictionaries, and no clear guide to understanding it. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphics, there was no true Rosetta Stone waiting to unlock its secrets. Earlier researchers had managed to piece together fragments by comparing Sumerian inscriptions with Akkadian translations created by Babylonian scribes centuries later. But the deeper texts remained almost unreachable. The myths, hymns, legal records, school writings, and even humanity's earliest love poetry still sat buried inside clay tablets no one fully understood. Kramer dedicated his life to solving them. Tablet by tablet, line by line, he slowly reconstructed an entire lost world. He compared repeated symbols, tracked language patterns across thousands of fragments, and built meaning through decades of painstaking analysis. By the time he released History Begins at Sumer in 1956, he had essentially rewritten humanity's understanding of the ancient world. Nearly everything modern audiences know about Sumerian civilization traces back to his work. The first written laws, the earliest schools, the invention of writing itself, even the oldest surviving love poem in human history. All of it emerged from translations Kramer produced inside the basement archives of the Penn Museum. At one point, archaeologists even joked that if a mysterious artifact appeared anywhere on Earth, it eventually found its way to Philadelphia and onto Kramer's desk. He had become more than a scholar. He was the authority everyone else depended on. When universities uncovered new Sumerian tablets, they were often sent directly to him for interpretation. By the time he formally stepped away from academic life in 1968, Sumerian studies had evolved into a respected academic field with its own journals, departments, and specialists. Much of that existed because Kramer had built the foundation himself. Researchers at institutions like Yale, Oxford, Chicago, and Berlin based entire careers on the translations he produced over decades. His influence stretched across nearly every corner of ancient Mesopotamian scholarship. But then, something strange started happening. Beginning in the 1960s, subtle comments began appearing in the footnotes of his papers. Most readers ignored them. They sounded like ordinary academic caution at first. Certain words could not be accurately translated. Some ideas resisted modern interpretation. Entire passages seemed impossible to fully explain. But those notes were not casual observations. They were warnings. As the years passed, the footnotes became more frequent and noticeably more uneasy. By the 1980s, Kramer wrote something that deeply unsettled researchers who later reviewed his archived material. "The more I study these texts," he admitted, "the less certain I become about what they truly mean." Most colleagues dismissed the statement as the doubts of an aging scholar. Some joked privately that Kramer had spent too many years isolated in the basement with ancient tablets. Academic institutions have a habit of quietly ignoring respected figures once they begin questioning the system they helped build. But Kramer was not losing confidence randomly. He had identified a problem buried inside the language itself. The Sumerians appeared to have no direct word for religion in the modern sense. Their texts showed no clear separation between the natural and supernatural worlds. Even the concept of a miracle barely existed because in their worldview there was no normal reality for a miracle to interrupt. To them, everything belonged to the same continuum. The divisions modern societies make between sacred and ordinary, spiritual and physical, simply were not present in the language. And most disturbing of all, the word scholars had translated for generations as God may not have meant a god at all. Kramer increasingly believed the term pointed towards something closer to a powerful intelligence or an awakened presence, not necessarily a deity in the way modern readers imagine one. That realization changed everything. Then Kramer said something that under normal circumstances should have exploded across international headlines. "When I translate a Sumerian text describing the beginning of existence," he explained, "I use modern words like creation and world. But I'm no longer certain the Sumerians meant anything close to what we mean by those terms." According to notes published later by the interviewer, Kramer's expression changed as he spoke. For a moment, he looked deeply unsettled. "And after 50 years of translation," he continued, "I fear I may have forced their ideas into categories they themselves would never have understood." That was the real turning point, not the uneasy footnotes, not the growing doubts in his academic papers. The true break came from a single tablet, sitting quietly inside a storage drawer in the Penn Museum basement, the same Nippur text Kramer had first translated back in 1949. For 40 years, it had bothered him without explanation, until 1988, when he finally realized what had been wrong the entire time. His original translation described divine beings handing civilization to humanity as a sacred gift. It was a clean interpretation, comfortable, familiar. It aligned perfectly with the standard understanding of ancient mythology, gods uplifting primitive humans. Every major word in the text seemed to support that reading. The term translated as gift, the term translated as human, the term translated as God. Everything fit together so neatly that no one questioned it. But Kramer eventually realized the problem was not the translation itself. It was the assumptions behind it. The word interpreted as gift could also mean awakening or remembering. The word translated as human could just as easily mean the sleeping ones or those unaware. And the term rendered as God did not necessarily describe a deity at all. In some contexts, it pointed towards something more like an awakened intelligence, a fully conscious presence, or a higher state of awareness. Once those alternate meanings were applied, the tablet transformed completely. Suddenly, the text was no longer describing supernatural beings, giving civilization to helpless humans. It was describing humanity awakening to abilities that already existed within them. And what the Sumerians called gods may not have been gods in the religious sense at all, but symbolic descriptions of consciousness, awareness, or forms of perception modern culture no longer understands. This was not a minor correction. It flipped the entire interpretation upside down. And according to Kramer, if this mistake existed in one foundational text, it likely existed in dozens more. Over the following weeks, he began re-examining the translations that had defined his career. Tablet after tablet revealed the same pattern. Modern assumptions had been layered onto ancient language. Categories familiar to 20th century scholars had been forced onto a civilization that may never have thought in those terms to begin with. The deeper he looked, the worse the problem became. Eventually, Kramer shared his concerns with two of the most respected scholars in the field. One of them was Dr. William Hallow at Yale University, a man whose own career had been built partly on Kramer's work. According to later accounts, Hallow reportedly turned pale after hearing the reinterpretation. "Sam," he supposedly told him, "this destroys everything. My work, my students' work, all of it." The second scholar, Dr. Miguel Civil, from the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, reacted even more harshly. "This is no longer scholarship," he allegedly said. "You need rest." What's important is that neither man directly challenged the translation itself. Instead, the reaction was immediate dismissal, and that response may explain why almost nobody outside a tiny academic circle has ever heard about Kramer's final conclusions. Samuel Noah Kramer died on November 26, 1990, at the age of 93. His obituary in the New York Times praised him as one of the great pioneers of ancient history. It celebrated his achievements, his international honors, and his role in introducing Sumerian civilization to the modern world. But there was one thing the obituary never mentioned. It never mentioned that near the end of his life, Kramer had begun questioning the very foundations of the field he helped create. According to people who were there, interviews discussing those doubts were recorded on film. The footage reportedly existed inside museum archives after his death, yet none of it was publicly released. The recordings were never included in retrospectives, never circulated broadly through academia, never made part of the official story. Instead, they quietly disappeared into storage. Meanwhile, Kramer's older translations remained in textbooks. Universities continued teaching Sumerian civilization through the same framework he had spent his final years trying to dismantle, because acknowledging his new interpretation would have forced institutions around the world to confront an uncomfortable possibility. What if the foundation itself was wrong? And academic systems rarely dismantle their own foundations willingly. The consequences would have been enormous. Kramer's translations did not influence only Sumerian studies. They shaped the modern understanding of the origins of civilization itself. University history courses, museum exhibits in London, Philadelphia, Berlin, and Baghdad, decades of dissertations and scholarly research, all of it rested in part on the framework he established. The scholars who rejected his conclusions were not necessarily acting out of malice. They were protecting the structure their entire field depended on. Because once a discipline is built on a certain interpretation, admitting the foundation may be flawed threatens everything constructed above it. And ignoring a 91-year-old scholar near the end of his life is far easier than rebuilding an entire academic worldview from scratch. But Kramer's final realization went far beyond translation errors. He believed he had uncovered something much deeper. Civil's reaction forced Kramer into a corner. If the academic world refused to seriously examine the evidence, then he would have to explain the larger picture himself. And that larger picture went far beyond a single clay tablet from Nippur. Because in Kramer's final years, he had become convinced the mystery was not only about what the Sumerians wrote, but about how they experienced reality itself. In one of the last interviews recorded before his death, Kramer reportedly tried to put that realization into words. Witnesses later said his voice was weak, almost fading, but his argument was remarkably clear. He began with mathematics. The Sumerians used a base 60 numerical system, the same structure still used today for measuring time, geometry, and angles. Historians traditionally explain this by pointing out how mathematically convenient the number 60 is. It divides cleanly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making calculations easier. But Kramer believed the deeper question had never been asked. What if base 60 was not simply a clever invention? What if it reflected the way the Sumerians naturally perceived relationships between quantities? What if their minds organized reality differently from ours? Then he turned to astronomy. Ancient Sumerian records tracked planetary cycles with astonishing precision. Their star charts were accurate enough that astronomers thousands of years later still relied on portions of that observational data. The conventional explanation credits centuries of patient sky watching passed down through generations. But again, Kramer challenged the assumption. What if the Sumerians were not merely observing patterns? What if they experienced them more directly? Through forms of awareness, modern consciousness no longer accesses. And then there was the sudden rise of Sumer itself. Around 4500 BCE, complex irrigation systems, advanced metallurgy, large-scale city planning, monumental ziggurats, and organized agriculture seemed to appear in the archaeological record with almost no visible developmental staircase leading up to them. Traditional historians call it rapid innovation. Kramer began wondering whether innovation was even the right word. What if those solutions did not need to be invented because they appeared obvious to minds functioning within an entirely different cognitive framework? But the most disturbing realization came from Sumer's decline. As Kramer revisited tablets written during the civilization's final centuries, around the period of Akkadian domination and eventual collapse, he noticed something subtle but deeply unsettling. The later texts felt different, not just stylistically, mentally. The earlier writings explored abstract principles, cosmic order, and ideas that seemed strangely expansive. But the later texts became increasingly practical, literal, and grounded in ordinary concerns. To Kramer, it almost looked as if the civilization itself was undergoing a form of cognitive deterioration, as though the people writing those later tablets no longer fully understood the mindset of their own ancestors. And then he looked again at the famous Sumerian king list. The ancient document, preserved today on the well-Blundell Prism in Oxford's Ashmolean Museum, describes the earliest rulers as reigning for impossibly vast spans of time, thousands, even tens of thousands of years. Later kings suddenly begin ruling for ordinary human lifetimes. Most historians interpret this as mythology gradually transitioning into historical record. But Kramer's final interpretation was very different. He wondered whether the text reflected a changing perception of reality itself. Maybe the earliest Sumerians experienced time, identity, and existence in ways fundamentally unlike later civilizations. And over centuries, that mode of awareness slowly narrowed until human experience became something more familiar, more limited, more like our own. In the final interview, weeks before his death, Kramer reportedly leaned toward the camera and said the one conclusion his colleagues refused to follow him toward. "I think the collapse of Sumer was not political," he said. "It was a collapse of consciousness." Then he paused. Something changed in the way they experienced reality. And once that changed, they could no longer sustain what they had built. According to witnesses, the room went silent. Then Kramer looked down at his hands and said something even more unsettling. "We are their descendants," he explained, trying to read their texts from the other side of that change. In other words, modern humanity may be incapable of fully understanding the Sumerians because we no longer think the way they thought. The interviewer reportedly did not know how to respond. Kramer simply looked exhausted. "Before I die," he said quietly, "please listen. We have misunderstood this, not just the details, the entire framework." Samuel Noah Kramer died in November 1990. The conferences continued. Universities kept teaching from the same textbooks. New editions printed the same interpretations. The scholars who dismissed his late-life conclusions carried on building careers atop the system he had spent decades creating. And today, 3 mysteries still remain unresolved. First, the interviews. According to individuals familiar with the Penn Museum archives, recordings of Kramer discussing these ideas still exist in some form. Yet they were never publicly released, never included in major retrospectives, and never widely shared with researchers outside a limited academic circle. The final recorded thoughts of the most influential Sumerologist in modern history remain effectively hidden from public view. Second, the reinterpretations. A small number of researchers in fields like cognitive anthropology and consciousness studies have attempted to continue exploring the questions Kramer raised near the end of his life. But their work remains far outside mainstream academia, and according to some scholars familiar with the debate, the resistance has less to do with evidence and more to do with institutional survival. Because accepting Kramer's late conclusions would force entire academic structures to reconsider their foundations. Too many careers, too many dissertations, too many textbooks, and finally, the tablets themselves. Roughly 100,000 Sumerian tablets are believed to exist across museums and collections worldwide. Experts estimate that less than half have ever been translated, and nearly all existing translations were produced using the same interpretive framework Kramer eventually came to distrust. Those tablets are still sitting in museums today, still waiting, still interpreted through categories Kramer believed fundamentally distorted their meaning, still waiting for someone willing to approach them the way he did in 1988, with the willingness to forget what they were expected to say. "Before I die, please listen," Kramer reportedly said. "We have gotten this wrong." And maybe the strangest part of all is this: the recordings may still exist. The untranslated tablets are still there, and the version of history taught in classrooms around the world still rests on a framework the man who built it spent his final years trying to dismantle. So what do you think Kramer actually discovered of his life? Drop your theory in the comments.